I see some new faces, so I will repeat my introduction from yes. I really like to ask the Yugoslavs to be a little bit more quiet. It's terrible. So, welcome to Anthropology and Social Change Visiting Scholar event. I'm very sorry or proud to say that we were banned on Instagram. I have no idea what that means, but apparently we are unable to do this on Instagram, so we'll do it record it on YouTube.
What did you do, Sean?
I'm not gonna ask. In any case, Katja, welcome back. This is the second event that we are hosting and welcoming our friend Katja Praznik from University of Buffalo, where she's an associate professor, also an author of a book that argues that art is actually work. And she's going to be speaking today, if I'm not mistaken, about the labor implications of what happens if we actually understand art as work. How can people organize? And is the union, that dreaded, complicated word, the right forum for people to organize? Katja, welcome, and thank you so much for coming for the second night in a row.
Good. That's good. It's working now. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Again, I need to thank Andre for the invitation, Sean for organizing everything, and you for your attention. So I see some of the closer. Yeah. Okay. Like this. Thank you all for coming again. I'm glad that some of you were here or maybe a lot of you were here last night, so I'm not going to repeat those things again. And we don't have to go over them. But I want to talk about why I think what is the importance of labor organizing in the arts. And I want to begin my talk today because yesterday I talked about art as work, right, or art as labor, and now I want to demonstrate how this can be put into practice, right? So why does theoretical research, which is of course also based on observations of what is happening in actual art production and in art world matters, but how we can then perhaps use this theory to make some changes. And so I want to begin my talk today by showing you a short 4-minute excerpt from a documentary film, Our Defeats. It was directed by Jean-Gabriel Perriot, a French documentary filmmaker. And the film was released in 2019, and it shows us conversations with a group of 16-year-old high schoolers that are contrasted with scenes in which they reenact parts from several films related to the May 1968 in France, mostly French directors, I believe. So the documentary is an excellent depiction of the state of society today and the potential for social struggle. While it offers a commentary on many important issues facing our capacities to enact revolutionary politics to make this world a better place, I want to focus on one particular aspect that is related to the youth's ignorance about unions and labor movements. Because I see labor organizing as one of the most important factors in the struggle against labor exploitation in the arts, I want us to look at the scene from this film. And so it will offer us, I think, a good way for us to tackle the question of organizing in the context of art and why organizing art workers and understanding the role of union actually matters. And so I want to warn you, so the film is in French, there are subtitles. Focus on the subtitles because the sound is awfully low and not really good. So for those of you who speak French, I apologize, but focus on the English subtitles. And first you will see this black and white, you can see already, right? So the black and white scene where students enact a scene from a film where a worker is informed about the concessions that the union made in striking workers' demands. And then this scene will be followed by a conversation with students about what took place. And finally, the last part of this short 4-minute clip, the director will be asking students about what is a union. So that's that. So let's go.
Les gens sont en train de travailler. Le coup des vacances, vous voulez vous faire travailler. La semaine de vos vacances. Il y a le recul, même si. Gagner. La réduction du temps de travail. Il a admis la réduction du temps de travail.
Alors pourquoi les autres, ça, ils rotent, ça? C'est pour avoir une demi-journée en plus de payer.
Mais non.
Mais oui, tiens.
Pas tous les travailleurs.
Non, bah, il y en a pas mal.
Les travailleurs qui rentrent aujourd'hui.
Bien 500.
Bien conscients de ce qu'ils ont fait. Bien conscients de ce qu'ils ont fait. Et c'est ça qu'il faut.
De toute façon, c'est pas la peine que je rentre, c'est faux. On va dire représailles. Les représailles. Allez-y, rentrez, vous. Rentrez, vous allez voir si quel bordel que c'est là-dedans. Oui, il y aura des représailles. Regarde là, que maintenant.
Julie, tu peux nous expliquer la scène que l'on vient de voir?
Alors, c'est devant une usine. Une femme se plaint des patrons qui leur ont pas donné ce petit réclame. Donc, il y a 2 syndicats qui lui disent qu'ils leur ont donné quand même quelques avantages comme des vacances, mais elle est pas convaincue et elle s'énerve. Voilà.
À ton avis, pourquoi elle refuse de rentrer à l'usine, cette femme?
Elle refuse parce que je pense qu'elle a dû batailler longtemps pour obtenir des droits et on l'a entre autres pas vraiment écouté et que c'est comme si ça avait servi à rien et on lui dit de retourner travailler et en gros d'abandonner tout ce dont elle voulait.
Tu ferais quoi, toi, si tu étais à sa place, si tu jugeais que tes conditions de travail sont vraiment indignes?
Je ferais comme elle, je pense. Je ferais comme elle parce que c'est assez révoltant quand même de ne pas avoir les droits, surtout qu'elle travaille dans des conditions assez désastreuses en soi. C'est assez sale tous les jours. Avoir des droits, c'est quand même assez important, je pense.
Est-ce que tu crois qu'on a toujours le choix de refuser un travail ou de retourner à l'usine après une grève? D'autant plus qu'aujourd'hui, perdre son travail, c'est prendre le risque de ne pas en trouver d'autres.
Oui, c'est ça le problème. Aujourd'hui, si on veut faire la grève et plus aller au travail, il faut carrément nous dire on ne peut jamais revenir et on n'aura plus de boulot, du coup c'est un peu compliqué. Et après, pour retrouver un autre travail, c'est un peu plus compliqué. Donc, c'est sûr qu'on n'a pas forcément le choix, je pense.
C'est quoi pour toi les syndicats? Ça sert à quoi?
J'en ai aucune idée.
Je sais pas du tout ce que c'est un syndicat. Je pense qu'un syndicat, je sais vraiment pas du tout ce que c'est.
Ça rejoint le droit un peu à côté ministre, syndicat. Je sais pas, mais je sais pas.
C'est quelque chose de politique. Les syndicats. Des personnes qui dirigent les entreprises et qui en font ce qu'ils veulent, en quelque sorte, sans faire régner le bien ou le mal. Ils dirigent juste pour avoir plus d'argent et puis c'est tout. Moi, je pense.
Les syndicats, c'est des mouvements qui protestent ou protègent les intérêts des travailleurs. Ouais.
Okay, so that's it. Yeah, so what is a union, right? We see that the students are not only mostly ignorant about what is a union, except the last one, who gives us some hope by guessing that union are movements that protect workers' interests. However, most students are either completely ignorant what might a union be, or they are confused about what function a union has and whose interest it represents. I found a student who said that unions are people who run companies and do whatever they want without imposing good or evil. They simply run companies to get rich. I'm like, excuse me, are you talking about capitalists or the union? So anyway, so that seems to be the general context in which we operate today. These students may be younger than us, but I will raise the assumption that many of us are or at one point have been in their shoes, not knowing what is the point of a union. After 3 decades or maybe more of neoliberal ideology and its attack on organized labor, that is not at all surprising. So now I want to complicate this context by bringing in the context of art, where we face another excruciating issue, because in the context of contemporary art, we are facing a persistent, even an enduring issue that what artists do is not perceived as labor, and that artists and people who work in the arts, such as curators, artists, any actually art workers, are not really workers. As such, this logic goes, they are not in need of a union, an institution that exists to protect socio-economic interests and labor standards of workers in a particular industry. But it gets even worse because the professional managerial class that runs art and cultural institutions are not necessarily also understood as managers. That is because art is structurally defined by its disavowal from economic and commercial aspects. Art, as I also talked about yesterday, is something autonomous, and the reasons for why we work in these fields don't have to do with matters of subsistence. And this then, of course, absolves us from considering the class dimensions in art production. So to say that directors of art institutions stand on the opposite side of the art workers they employ or whose work they commission for the institutions is often frowned upon because we supposedly have a common interest, and that is the, almighty importance of art and culture. But what is wrong with this picture, you may ask? Well, it obscures and mystifies the causes for the central elephant in the room that I have not mentioned yet today. The poor working conditions, paltry remuneration, and lack of labor standards for art workers. And just to clarify, by artwork I refer to the activity, not to the outcome or the result that we see on the walls here. So the visual arts context may be really the most straightforward, offers really straightforward examples to point out the issue, but poor working conditions and lack of payment for the actual labor of art workers is impressed in all sectors of arts and manifest to the present day. So you can see it with writers, with theater makers, dancers, and so on. So if you recall the incident that I was talking about yesterday about this Danish artist Jens Hanning with the 2 empty frames, the Take the Money and Run. So I want to say a little bit more about that exhibition, right? So I mentioned the title of the exhibition was Work It Out, and it had to do with the idea of work in contemporary capitalist society. And that exhibition was not some no-name artist exhibition. Quite the contrary. Among them were artists who are well-known personalities speaking against the art system. For instance, Hito Sterl was part of the exhibition, and there was also an artist, Marie Tams, who is currently a president of the largest Danish arts association, Bildende Kunstners Forbund, or BFK, or Danish Visual Artists. And so along with her, a bunch of other members of this Danish association were on this exhibition. And the association's central aim, as we can read in the English description on their webpage, is to influence current policies in a way that enhances economic and social security for visual artists. And as you remember, I asked them if they're going to protest because people were not properly paid or remunerated at that exhibition, so they definitely are not putting the money where their mouth is. And I also want to say that the reason why I know all these things is because I talked to the artists. No? So we conducted a really long interview about the problem of labor exploitation, and I offered it to several news outlets, and of course none of them bite, because who wants to talk about exploited art workers when it is much more appealing to reproduce, right? The starving, mischievous artist epitome and fire up the public attention by the trope of an artist who, you know, breaks rules and steals from poor, helpless art institutions. And of course, Marx forbids we should follow art workers into the hidden abode of production, because as he notes, Marx, there's a sign on the entrance that says, that stares us in the face, no admittance except on business. And I shall add that we should dare not open the issues of class struggle in the arts. So why is that the case? And as I have written in my books, this state of affairs results from art not being understood as work, which turns artwork into this form of invisible labor, and which is at the heart of the feminist, what feminist scholar Maria Mies calls housewifization of labor. And she uses this term, housewifization of labor, to describe flexible, atypical, devalued, and unprotected forms of work. So the issue in the arts and in general with the so-called atypical work is the post-Fordist transformation of work and the legal character of employment that we see in the fragmentation of labor and employment relations, which is a mechanism that structurally weakens the position of workers. And so the sweeping power of neoliberal rationality about the panacea of market regulation and its central motor, competition, bank on selling the idea of freedom and autonomy of a worker, and these are the two quintessential traits of the modern Western ideal of an artist. And so they contribute to the mystification of class struggle and to an erosion of working class solidarity in the arts and creative sector. So here I need to bring in a little bit of a history, and I promise I'll said something more about that yesterday. What is important here is you remember I said that there's an interesting story about art and artisans, so that's what I'm gonna say now. So with the rise of capitalism and the shift from patronage to the market system, an important separation entered the stage. An artist and an artisan became two different things. The artist became an exceptional individual, an artist genius separated from the idea of craft, facility, and skilled labor. And the separation of arts and crafts is also significant on two levels if we wish to discuss the position of art workers in class struggle and in the present-day arts and cultural sector. This separation contextualizes the invisibility of artwork and its economic devaluation on the one hand, and on the other hand, the transformation explains the proletarization of artisans and the inscription of artists into the idioms of bourgeois culture. Because artisans have skills, they reproduce and imitate and do it for the money. Artists are original, they create freely, and they don't do it for the money. And so while artisan and artists were previously interchangeable terms, in the 18th century, all the nobler aspects of the older image of the artist-artisan, such as grace, invention, and imagination, were ascribed solely to the artist, whereas the artisan or craftsperson was said to possess only skill, to work by rule, or to care primarily for money. And this is something that is described by Larry Shinner, who wrote this book, The Invention of Art, where he describes this distinction. What this means, and I'm citing Shinner here, freedom of the craftsperson to work at their own pace, to conceive of their work as a whole, was gone, and that most of those who used to be in the artisans were forced either to become an artisan executing orders and designing, or to venture the precarious independence of the artist. So all these ideologies, right, or ideological elevations of artists are not merely conceptual, right? So this is to say they're not, I mean, as much as they're abstract and a matter of theory, they have very concrete consequences. And they on material and life conditions of people who work in the arts and who are making the arts. And so the division between artist and artisan stimulated this process through which artwork became invisible, and it brought on this hegemonic attitude that what artists do is not labor, but what they do is creation. And it's a result of this artistic genius or talent. And the division between artist and artisan stimulated the process through which artwork became invisible, and artist labor became essentialized, just like the labor of housework, which is what I talked about yesterday, right? So the art workers' work was also relegated to this private sphere, where work is no longer not only seen, but not defined as work anymore. And so this invisibility, right? And I talked about this yesterday, so I think I can leave this out, these two key things that happen, right? One is the essentialization, and the other one is the separation into the private sphere. And that artists actually experience a similar kind of invisibility. But what I think is important, again, about this comparison is, right, that the essentialization in the case of artwork has this positive aspect. You remember I said that if we that what is similar between housework and artwork is the fact that they're invisible, devalued, not seen as work. That's what they have in common. What makes the difference between the two is that one is seen as negative and the other one is seen as a positive thing, right? And so the downside is that this makes it harder to rebel or strive against reform, and it is way easier to accept unpaid free labor in the arts. And so the problem, of course, is also that this attitude about, work not being paid, or you are doing it for fun or not for the money, is not only something that befalls the artists, but it's also spread in on the most creative sector workers. And you don't have to be an artist to be told that the fact that you work in the arts means you don't care about the money or payment because you enjoy it, and you like its non-standardized aspects, the freedom, and so on and so forth. So the issue with art workers then is this invisibility of their labor is not seen as a form of oppression and not nor as a convenient mechanism of exploitation. Moreover, artists themselves have a hard time identifying as workers, and the managers of art institutions, along with government representatives and most policymakers, expediently reproduce this meritocratic logic based in social and cultural capital in order to take advantage of the cheap labor. So the managers of institutions have no problem that artists don't see themselves as workers. And for organizing art workers, by which I refer not only to artists but all other professions and workers who work in this sector, these attitudes have, like I said, not only theoretical but practical consequences. I think that that's why these Marxist feminist insights are vital, along with the lessons from the labor movement and organizing. Because using Marx's argument, feminists taught us that under capitalism, or the capitalist mode of production, one also needs to recognize something as work in order to be able to struggle against its exploitation. So as long as you don't see that as work, you won't see the exploitation in it. And I want to come back to this distinction between artist and artisan, because this historical division also has consequences for labor organizing in the arts. Because with this distinction, right, when artists became this genius, exceptional individual towards artisans, Also all the collective action and all the structures such as guilds through which artisans were able to secure and protect their economic and professional standards were also gone, right? So they, perhaps the artisans maintained these guilds and so on, but the artists surely didn't. And so these attitudes certainly impact the possibilities that artists would struggle for a living wage and labor standards, or that they should do so collectively. And of course, how could they if the entire self-definition omits the fact that what they do is work and is built on this romantic idea of exceptional individuality. So individualism and art is almost like we can put an equation next to it. But the labor history teaches us that an individual, a worker or an art worker, has the weakest position on a market, be it labor or art market, or any other kind of labor, any kind of market. And I want to cite a really important thought by Sergio Bologna, who said the following. Individuals who think of themselves as independent beings, who don't need anyone, who base their existence not on relationships with others, but on individualism, are precisely those who lose their freedom to a large extent, especially in employment relationships. They negate solidarity, community, and mutual help, and find themselves the objects of the most unbridled exploitation because, as individuals, they have the weakest position in the market, right? So if you're alone on the market, you're screwed. But neoliberal rationality and loves, right, creativity, the idea of self-realization, the idea of individuality, as if we people live in a vacuum, right, and are not reliant on social security and other solidarity and safety networks. And even more, neoliberal ideology dissolves this notion of labor and its connection to subsistence. So work, they claim, is a vehicle for self-realization, not for making a living. And do what you love or love what you do, which is something that I also talked about yesterday. No payment, no problem, right? Who cares about that? We are, we are realizing our individual potentials. We don't work, we are in the business of being creative. And here is where feminist insights about essentializing certain kinds of work are central. They help us to understand how the mechanisms of invisibility are relevant to the capitalist exploitation, and why it is so detrimental to divorce labor from art, and why it matters that we also call artists workers. So art worker today is most commonly also defined as an atypical worker, which is in fact the code word for self-employed, or gig worker if you want. Right, so we are small micro enterprises, entrepreneurs. Her work is a service outsourced by art institutions and other cultural and art organizations. Hence, it is common to think of art workers as creative entrepreneurs or even micro companies or a one-woman band. And by doing so, what we lose is this employment relationship. So artwork is invisible and therefore culturally and economically devalued, but this is where these two worlds collide, right? So the one of the arts and the one of the contemporary labor. Because Bologna convincingly also argues that atypical workers or self-employed workers are denied the status of workers. They are classified as these small or micro companies or even one-woman businesses. And this is very similar with artists, self-employed. And you may ask me, what is the problem? Well, the main problem here is, which we usually don't talk about, is that there is a dehumanizing aspect, even if it is couched in the language of freedom and autonomy, right? A human being is not an organization, or a business, or a sole enterprise. And Bologna says that this is an absurd, that this is really absurd to call a person an enterprise. And he has a really good point, because an enterprise is by definition an organization that has as its goal not simply to produce a mass of commodities, but also surplus value. And so this is generated in the process of cooperation with the use of human intelligence and labor, technology, and economic theories also tell us that there are three necessary elements that define a business or an enterprise. Capital, which is invested by owners, management, which organizes and directs the resources, and labor power, no? The workers. So you have to have three elements to be a company, and you can't be one person having all those three elements. It's not possible. And that's why Bologna rightly asks, how can a small businesswoman or entrepreneur do all these? That one should do all these as one single individual is the neoliberal ruse that the post-40s transformation brought on, since it redefined the legal nature of employment relationship. So the worker got renamed into an enterprise because in order to make an employment contract into a business contract, a worker needs to be called an enterprise. And then you can forget about the labor standards and all that. Consider for a moment what would the institutions present to the audiences if art workers stop providing these services for which in majority of cases they receive insufficient to no remuneration. For example, an art worker to a gallery or a freelance actor, costume designer, scenographer, I don't know, theater director, there would be a lot would be lost, right? Because a lot of art workers are really outsourced by these institutions. And even if these institutions are not necessarily for profit, right? Often museums would be non-for-profit businesses, even in the US. This creates also a double-structured labor market. Perhaps in Europe this is more visible than in the US, but you have workers who are employed in institutions, and you have others who are outsourced. And are defined as enterprises. And this distinction, which is also a form of legal fiction, is therefore the one of the central tools, not to say the weapons, in contemporary class struggle. So what happens is that you have people who are employed and people who are outsourced. And the division, of course, labor movement, the history of labor movement also teaches us, is what they want. The capitalists always want to divide the labor force in different categories so that, we argue among ourselves rather than organize. So while art workers might indeed own some means of production, they nevertheless largely depend on art institutions to present or disseminate results of their work. Or we could also say that the institutions depend on this outsourced labor for their program. So again, right, if we want to consider for a moment what would the institutions present to the audiences if art workers would stop providing these services for which in majority of cases they are not paid. And so that's, I think, one of the key issues with this definition of self-employed and the enterprise. And I think I want to cite here a German scholar, Michael Heinrich, who explains that many formerly self-employed people are still proletarian. Because they live de facto from the sale of their labor power, except that this occurs under potentially worse conditions than under a formal wage relationship, right? So if you're employed, perhaps you're even unionized, you have your labor standards secured. If you're outsourced and you are self-employed and you think of yourself as an enterprise, these labor standards you are to secure for yourself, right? And so indeed, I think that this is really relatable to art workers in the creative sectors where most of them do have this legal form. That's how they operate. However, like I said, the issue with art workers is that the invisibility of their labor is not seen as a form of oppression, nor as a convenient mechanism for exploitation. And that's why I think labor organizing and the struggle for labor standards and a living wage in the arts sounds so bewildering. Because artists and art workers are constantly convinced and persuaded that they are not workers, but enterprises. And so I want to come now to this question of why labor organizing matters, right? Because as I explained to you, I wrote this book and I wrote another one before about the paradox of unpaid labor. And after writing about all this, what happened to me was that, let's say, museums, institutions would invite me to write a text for an exhibition catalog. And usually I would say, well, did you pay the artists on the exhibition? Usually they don't. And I said, like, you know what, screw you, I'm not gonna write my text about a paradox of unpaid labor so that you can continue doing the same shit you keep doing, right? And nothing changes. And so I said, okay, so there has to be some kind of change. And so this ongoing pursuit of mine to see how a change could happen led me to labor organizing and to really see how the labor organizing theory and discourse can be put in practice in the context of art. And especially because I wanted to find a collective and not an individualistic approach to issues of this exploitation of art, right? Because if you remember, again, I'm coming back to this Danish artist Jens Hanning, right? He was one artist, fairly established, who decided to rebel about the working conditions. And the rest of the people who were in the exhibition didn't want to do anything. And these individualistic approaches merely reproduce and perpetuate these Western ideals of freedom, exceptionality, and autonomy that breed competition rather than ideals of cultural solidarity that are vested in collective power. So the individualistic approach to solving the problem of miserable remuneration or for challenging the status quo leaves art workers and artists usually isolated as black sheep, right? They are undermined, they're called difficult, but like like I said, the labor movement struggles teaches us that isolating workers and pitting them against other workers is a classic anti-union or anti-labor practice, right? So that goes in addition to convincing a worker that she is not a worker. So these are top two union busting strategies, is to divide the workers and to convince them that they are not workers in the first place. And I think that really we have seen in many, many examples of artists rebelling solo against institutions, and really what happens, even in this case of Jens Hanning, for instance, he is the black sheep. The price of his artwork didn't go up, it went down, because he's a troublemaker and so on and so forth. So that's why this brings us now to this whole idea of labor organizing. And some of you, since you are from here, you may be familiar with the person I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to use a term called whole worker organizing. And the term is used in the context of working class unionism and more recently by a really experienced labor organizer, and she's also a scholar and researcher who works at the Berkeley Institute for Labor. Her name is Jane McAlevey. She wrote 3 books. I highly recommend them if you're into labor organizing. And so she says that in order to build the mass participatory union, we need this approach of whole worker organizing. And what it emphasizes is that we as working people are never just that, right? That we are not only workers, but we wear many different hats. We have a variety of interests based on, they are not necessarily based just in where we work, but also other things. However, all these other interests don't only make us merely individuals who participate in many different interest groups, or for instance, NGOs, non-for-profits, different kinds of organizations that are usually related to the so-called civil society. But we are a society characterized by class relations in which we occupy different positions. But like I said, we are not just workers, we are more than that, and a large majority strives to have better lives. And so with McAlevey's words, whole worker organizing begins with the recognition that real people do not live two separate lives. One beginning when they arrive at work and punch the clock, and another when they punch out at the end of the shift. Whole worker organizing seeks to engage whole workers in the betterment of their lives. And so I think that this is really important because organizing art workers is by no means anything fancy, and it doesn't look very revolutionary when you do it. Because it really depends on building human connections and improving relations among people who really think that they don't have any power. When you talk to a lot of people who work in the art sectors, they are really trapped, they feel very helpless, and they don't think they have any power. And so I think that these ideas from the labor movement are important. And one important aspect in this whole labor organizing discourse that I also find very useful is a distinction between different kinds of unions. And I want to talk more about the organizing model because this is in contrast to the servicing model of a union. So the servicing model of a union would be a union where members of the union are like customers, right? The union provides a service for the worker. But when you are focusing on the organizing model, you are actually building a way more participatory union. So you don't perceive the union as the mediator, but the workers are the union and they're really involved in what they do. So they are engaged and they are part of the solution. So when we organize workers, they are part of what helps them solve the situation, because that also, somebody feels then way more empowered in doing that. This organizing model centers workers in a tightly knit collective and gives union members a sense of power. So workers in a bottom-up fashion form committees, decide about the strategy, action plans, they actively and en masse participate in bargaining, canvassing non-members, and are supported by staff and leaders. And so the union is then highly visible, it educates members and situates the struggle for wages or benefits and working conditions in the larger context of improving communities' quality of life. And so I think that this approach is key also for the context of arts and creative sector, because the recognition or acknowledgement that art is also work and that people working in the arts are not merely there to spread their love of art needs to be combined with appreciation for what art can do and how art is powerful bond for communities. And also sometimes, but I would definitely say not by default, art can play a vital role in social change. So in other words, the whole worker organizing strives not to build an alliance between social movement practice and union organizing, but rather the point is to bring the community organizing techniques right into the workplace. And so that, I think, is what is really interesting about this concept. And what I also like about it is that this whole worker or deep organizing is actually a set of skills that anyone can learn. It's not, you don't have to have special talents. Yesterday it was funny when we were at that restaurant, I don't know if anyone noticed, in the bathroom they said like, are you a talented bartender? And what if you're not a talented bartender? So you don't have to be a talented labor organizer, because you can be a skilled labor organizer by teaching yourself the skills. So of course Jane McAlevey didn't invent the skills nor the techniques. She keeps, every time she emphasizes it, that she learned it from previous generations. But they are really techniques that can be emulated and are really important. Some of them are, one of them is the one-on-one conversation, which that's why it is so important that we have, which helps us build the relationships. Then the other one is, for instance, doing a collective power structure analysis where everyone tries to discuss to see where are the forces which are against us and so on and so forth. A lot of this work is done really one-on-one, right? In groups, it's not on social media. Facebook, Instagram is great, but it doesn't really help you. And I can tell you from my own current experiences organizing in union that is true. Because it's very easy to press a like, but it's a completely different thing to talk to a person and help them understand why it is important that they are a union member and how they can get involved. So I want to come back to the film that I showed you at the beginning, and I'll finish here, right? After they shot this film, the students were part of a protest. And while they seem to be really ignorant, right, as we saw them here in the film about the power of or relevance of the union or collective action, they apparently did understand that. And I think that art workers will, also sway that solidarity and collective action is really the way of how we can move also things in the art world. So I'll finish here.